Hey everybody, and welcome back to the RTS tutorial series. In today's lesson we will cover camera movement, and I will just warn you that this is not the final sort of controls we'll have set up for our camera. In fact, these controls down the road will be slightly glitchy, and we're going to use this as a sort of learning tool to see how we can troubleshoot issues. To give you an idea, my plan is, I think in the fourth or fifth lesson, to address the issues raised by this one. That said, our learning objectives today are how to access and change our action mappings and our axis mappings, how to get our camera to move forwards and backwards, and how to move the camera right to left. And we'll even start to look for some of the errors that might come up. So the blueprints involved in today's session is just our player controller, which already holds our reference to the pawn, and will now hold our controls to the camera. And things we need to consider. Again, do we want to use the inherited movement component, which is what we'll do for now, or do we want to change the pawn's transformation, which is what we'll start to do during lessons 4 and 5? And what controls do we want to include? Are the standard WADS keys enough, or do we want to add in arrows? Now for this tutorial, we'll add in arrows just so you can see how it works. Honestly, it's fairly simple. If you can access your access mapping and you can add them in, and you don't even have to do anything else beyond that. And again, we're going to think about what errors might come up as we do this. So that said, today's lesson should be relatively brief, and I look forward to seeing you on the other side. So here we are back in our launcher, or our editor, sorry. And if we hit play, we can see our camera, our little sphere icon down there, a sphere mesh down there. And we can't currently move it, so let's put in our movement controls. Now, something I forgot to comment on in terms of considerations is where we're going to put our movement controls. Do we want to put them in the camera itself or in the controller? Both are viable options, and both have different sort of cost-benefit ratios. When I started out, I tended to find putting it directly into the, camera itself, the camera pawn, or the character with the camera attached to it, worked better for me. However, as I've gotten further and further into this, and have tried different techniques, I have found putting it in the controller just somehow is more efficient. I tend to have less issues where I have things that need to communicate with the controller and the pawn getting confused and not passing references correctly. Whereas if they're all passed into the controller, and the controller kind of acts as a relayer, as that sort of like that image shows, that marionette that holds the that marionette board that holds the strings up. It's easier for that to pass information onto the parts under it than for it to take information from multiple sources and try to pass it to other sources. Just easier for it to all come to the controller, I find. So we're going to put our controls in our player controller. But before we do that, we need to set up our command. So we're going to go to settings, and we're going to go to our project settings. And remember, like I said last time, there is no save button here. Our changes automatically are stored. And if you want to save them, you can export them and you can import. So let's go to our inputs here under engine. And inputs just stores our key mappings and our access mappings. So open up our action mappings first. Well, we are going to do set destination, but we're going to do it very differently. So let's get rid of this. And we aren't going to do VR, so let's get rid of this. Now, in terms of action mappings, right now we don't need anything. However, next lesson we will. Let's look at our access mappings now. We have move forward, move right, and turn right. Now, I'll say that there are things we could do with turn right. It just doesn't work well with what we want to do. And there are other ways for us to worry about that. So let's get rid of that for now. And let's extend these two. And as you can see, we have our typical WADS movements here, with W and S being forwards and backwards, and D being our left and A being our right. And you'll notice that left and right are stored under move right, and forward stores both forward and backwards. That's simply because forward, if you think about this, going forward, we set that to a scale of 1. The inverse of that, -1, would be going backwards. Just like this idea of if we move right on a scale of 1, if we inverse that to -1, then we're going to go left. Now, these controls, sorry about that if you can hear my dog shaking in the background. These controls are fairly standard. And if you like them, that's fine. But maybe you want to include something else. Maybe you want to include the arrow keys. So let's click this twice to add a little plus icon, and do the same down here next to move right. And we're going to type in up. And this will stand for up arrow. And we're going to leave it as a scale of 1. So it represents the same thing W does, move forward. As for backwards, we'll type in down. And we'll go to keyboard and select down, and we'll change this scale to -1. So it does the same thing S does. And notice for the convention, I followed what they have here. I have W, up, or positive, S, negative, up, positive, and down, negative. I could reorganize it so both ups are together, but I actually kind of like having it set up this way so I can see the pairs together. If I pair the letter keys versus the arrow keys. And here, we're going to type in right, because the first one was D, which is right. And I'm going to just get rid of gamepad by clicking that arrow. Unfortunately, it'll come back in the next one. And here under keyboard, I'm going to take the first option of right. Again, I'm going to leave the scale at 1, because I wanted to do the same thing as D and move us towards the right. And I am then going to type in left into this next one, and minimize the gamepad again. Select left, and just like before, I'm going to change this setting to -1. So it's doing the same thing as our A key. So that is pretty much everything we need to do for setting up our mappings. Now we need to implement these mappings. So if we close this out, and we open up our player controller, we see our reference cast from last time. And in fact, this is going to be useful because we're going to need to get that reference. So we're going to take our camera pawn reference. And actually, before we do anything with that, there is something I like to do. I like to categorize these things. References. So under category, if you just click when it says default, there's no drop down yet. Just click and type in what you want to call the category. Unfortunately, it doesn't populate alphabetically. It populates by the creation order. Alright, so I'm going to drag off of this, and I'm going to get. Now, what do I need to get from this? Well, we have built-in movement controls. If you don't remember, let's open up our pawn real quick so you can see. We've included this floating movement, and we're going to use that to control our pawn for now. When we get into our later videos, I believe it is 5, we will change this. And hopefully I'll remember actually to delete it off the copy for you guys, because in my copy, I left it on until I went to copy out my iterations. I'll even take a screenshot for you guys so you can see how bad that was. Just this random variable just sitting there, and I was like, why is that still there? So pulling off the camera pawn reference, I typed in float. And it's going to highlight a whole bunch of things, but it's probably going to try to auto-select get floating pawn movement. If that doesn't show up after float, just keep typing, floating, pawn, and movement, and eventually you'll have get and set. So we want get. Okay, now that we have both of these, we want to tell the system to do something with them. So we're going to right-click, and I'm going to type in move forward, and I want to have the input axis move forward, and I'm going to do move right down here, and again I want the axis event, not the axis value, always the axis event. So what an axis event is, it's telling the system to always be watching for when someone hits the button associated with this or whatever else axis mappings we've included. Now you'll notice my setup, I have this in the middle here, and the reason is instead of calling this twice and just eating up the space, I'm going to call it once because I'm going to use it for both of these. And let's just see if I can get this a little bit nicely organized. There we go. And so, you know, this code is going to evolve over time. There's no way around that. You know, I know already going in that I should have a conditional statement in here. And if you haven't worked out what conditional statement that's going to be, I'll give you a hint. It's going to be one that responds to disabled movement. Or sorry, that checks if movement's disabled. But, you know, we haven't gotten to the part where we need to consider how we need to name those variables yet. So instead of guessing at what we're going to name things, we'll skip it for now, but be fully aware that we're going to have it in a little bit later. Alright, so off of the floating pawn, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just drag out part way. Actually, no, I'll do it easier. I'm just going to drag it out, and I'm going to type in add input vector. And I'm going to drag that up here. And with it still highlighted, with it highlighted, I'm going to move my mouse down here. And wherever you put your mouse when you want to paste, or when you use Control W, which replicates, and that's what I'm going to do now, it puts the node or set of nodes, if it's a group, where your mouse is. If it's a set of nodes, it puts the center where your mouse is. So there's a node. I'm going to double click on this blue line that's coming off floating pawn into add input vector. And I am going to drag it down to here. If it will let me. Sorry, I tried to drag it into the execute instead by mistake. So now that that's put in there, we are now telling these two nodes to target the floating movement, or the target of the add vector input is the movement component of this pawn. And now we're going to tie our execute to our input vectors. So all this is saying is once you hear, you know, our forward or W or back or S key pressed, do this. The next thing we're going to include is we're going to do the same thing down here. Now, you're probably wondering, well, we don't have any vectors we can put in, so how is this going to work? Well, if you right-click and you split struct, we'll do that to both of them. I really wish I had duplicated this one later. We can drag off our access value here, which is a float, into the floats that make up the vector the vector from earlier. So now that it's split, we need to think about which vectors from move forward do we care about. Well, if you remember what I said last time when we were looking at the pawn, let's go back to that view part, and let's highlight our sphere. That red line, the x-axis is our forward. So we want to, you know, drag that out from our axis value into our x-axis. And this is our right. And so if x is our forward, y is our right and left, with z being our up and down. So before we do that, let's just make sure this works. Let's just make sure we can move forward. Yep, we can move forward and backwards. Ooh, there's a little bit of a glitch there. And we can't move left and right, so we haven't hooked it up yet. So let's hook that up. Let's drag that into y. Just because, again, that's our right and left axis. Compile and save. And let's hit play. Okay, so we can move forwards. We can move backwards. That was W and S. Up arrow, down arrow. A, D, left, right. And you see a little bit of motion blur there on the sphere, I bet. That's a problem we can deal with a little bit later. That's a minor bug, and honestly one we shouldn't be too concerned with because we are going to hide the sphere later on. Now, we can combine the motions of W and D together to get diagonal movement, and AS as well, and WD, or sorry, WA. Ooh, let's do S and D for a second. As you can see, we have a slight error. Something is happening. You know, this shouldn't happen. So let's address that real quick. Let's close this out, and let's think about what might be causing that for a moment. So it can't be anything in here, because nothing in here is dealing with the actual physical assets. It's dealing with their location and what is being moved. So it can't be this. It has to be something in here. Well, we have a sphere. And, it's a static mesh. So let's take a look. Does it have any collisions? Well, yeah, it has a whole bunch, actually. So, is it in this? Before we change anything, let's see what else might have collisions. Does this have collisions? No, it doesn't. So we know it's not sphere. Could be sphere. Could be our spring arm, because it has the collision test right there. And it could be our camera, potentially? No. And if you can't find what you're looking for, you can type up here. So if I type in collision, we have collision, but nothing is selected there. And that's just with effect navigation. If we type in collision here, we have this. And same with the sphere. Now, let's see what happens when we change the sphere. Let's turn this to no collision and see what happens. We'll compile and save. Let's go forward. Oh, nope, so it wasn't that. Something else is causing the issue. Well, we only had one other option. So I'm going to click this little green arrow here to reset to default. Maybe we'll still need to do that. Maybe. And I'll tell you now we won't. But maybe we would have. It's easier to undo what you have done, test the next part. Sorry for my dog again. And then combine the two parts together to see what happens. So let's go to our spring arm. And let's turn off do collision test. Compile and save. And let's move the camera. And there we go. We're passing through the objects. So we've addressed one error. But there's another error we need to think about. I can go all the way off the map. And that wouldn't be useful. I mean, if I ended up having edge scroll and I walk away from my computer for an hour, and my mouse is all the way at the top of my screen, by the time I get back, I'm going to be so far from the map that I'm just going to want to quit the game because it's going to take me ages to get back to where I should be. So we need to think about setting up boundaries. Now, there are some other issues that we can't quite see yet with how we set up movement. But as we get into the next lesson, and the lesson after that, those errors will become very apparent, and we'll have to address them after we see them. So that said, I look forward to seeing you guys in the next lesson. If you have any comments, anything you want to see, please let me know. Likes are very much appreciated. And make sure to hit that subscribe and notify icon so you know when the next tutorial is up. Look forward to seeing you guys again.